Did you know that the director of The Brood was going through one of the most painful chapters of his life while making this movie? And he poured every drop of that anger, sadness, and fear straight into the film. David Cronenberg didn't just direct The Brood, he lived it. This wasn't just a horror movie about strange creatures and a troubled family. It was a confession, a diary written in blood and rubber and rage. The pain you feel watching this film, it was real. Every frame carried a wound, and what came out of that wound became one of the most disturbing and personal horror films ever made. Most people watch The Brood and see monsters, but behind those monsters there are stories you've never heard. Stories about real tears, broken marriages, dangerous sets, and ideas so wild that even the actors didn't know what to expect. Let's dive in and discover 20 weird and amazing facts about The Brood. On number 20, a divorce wrote the script. Most horror movies start with an idea, a nightmare, a what if. But The Brood started with a broken heart. When David Cronenberg sat down to write the screenplay, he wasn't just imagining monsters. He was fighting a real battle, a brutal custody war over his daughter. His marriage had fallen apart. The courts were involved. Lawyers were circling, and every day felt like a new kind of horror. Cronenberg later said that the film was his way of processing the ugliest emotions he had ever felt. The rage, the helplessness, the fear that someone he loved, his own child, could be taken from him or shaped into someone he didn't recognize. In the movie, the character of Nola Carveth, played by Samantha Eggar, is a deeply disturbed woman undergoing a radical and terrifying form of therapy. Her husband, Frank, played by Oliver Reed, is desperate to protect their daughter from the fallout. Sound familiar? Cronenberg didn't even try to hide it. He later described The Brood as his version of a divorce movie, his Kramer vs. Kramer, except with mutant children and body horror. While other directors might have gone to therapy, Cronenberg went to the camera. He turned his pain into art, and the result was a film so raw that it made audiences uncomfortable, not just because of the monsters, but because of the emotions underneath them. What looked like fantasy was autobiography. The scariest thing about The Brood isn't the creatures, it's the truth hiding behind them. Number 19. Oliver Reed was terrified, but not of the monsters. Oliver Reed was one of the toughest actors in Hollywood. The man was famous for bar fights, wild parties, and never backing down from anything. But on the set of The Brood, something scared him. And it wasn't the creatures or the makeup effects. It was David Cronenberg's mind. Reed later admitted that when he first read the script, he didn't fully understand what he was getting into. He knew it was a horror film. He knew it was dark. But as filming went on, Cronenberg kept pushing the story into stranger and more disturbing territory. Reed found himself in scenes that made his skin crawl, not because of fake blood, but because of the psychological weight behind them. One scene in particular shook him. It was the moment where Frank discovers the truth about what Nola's body has been doing. Reed didn't have to act shocked. He genuinely was. Cronenberg had a habit of saving the most disturbing reveals for the last possible moment, so actors wouldn't have time to overthink their reactions. He wanted raw, unfiltered emotion, and with Reed, he got it. Despite his tough guy reputation, Reed respected Cronenberg deeply by the end of the shoot. He called the director one of the most intelligent and unsettling people he had ever worked with. Coming from Oliver Reed, that was both a compliment and a warning. The man who feared nothing found something that made him pause. That wasn't acting, that was real unease. Number 18. Samantha Eggar didn't know about the final scene until the last day. Samantha Eggar delivered one of the most shocking performances in horror history. But here's the wild part. She didn't know how shocking her final scene would be until the very last day of filming. Cronenberg deliberately kept the details of the climax from her. He told her the basics. He explained the emotion, but the physical reality of what she would have to do on camera? He saved that reveal for the morning of the shoot. When Eggar arrived on set and saw what was prepared for her, the practical effects, the prosthetics, the sheer visceral nature of the scene, she was stunned. In the film's climax, Nola reveals the full extent of her transformation. She shows Frank, and the audience, exactly how the brood children are born. It is one of the most infamous scenes in body horror history. Eggar had to act through layers of prosthetic makeup and perform actions that would make most people gag, and she did it brilliantly. Cronenberg later said he kept the secret on purpose. He wanted Eggar's first reaction to be genuine. He wanted that look of intensity and raw commitment to come from a real place, not from weeks of rehearsal that might dull the edge. It worked. Eggar's performance in that scene became legendary. Critics and fans still talk about it decades later. She gave everything she had, and the reason it feels so powerful is because she walked into that moment almost as blind as the audience. What looked like a prepared performance was actually a leap of faith. Number 17. The brood children were played by real kids, with a twist. Those creepy, silent, murderous children in the film? They weren't created entirely with special effects. Real children played the brood. But Cronenberg had a very specific, and very clever, trick up his sleeve. He cast children who were unusually small for their age. Then he dressed them in specially designed suits and masks that made them look inhuman. The combination of real child-sized movement and alien appearance created something deeply unsettling. Audiences couldn't quite figure out what they were looking at. Were they puppets? Were they dolls? Were they real? That confusion was exactly what Cronenberg wanted. The children moved like real kids, because they were. They ran, they grabbed, they attacked with the clumsy energy of actual small humans. But their faces were blank. Their skin looked wrong. Their proportions seemed just slightly off. It was the uncanny valley before anyone had a name for it. Working with the child actors was tricky. Cronenberg had to be careful not to scare them. The sets were strange, the costumes were uncomfortable, and the scenes they were in often involved violence. Though, of course, the kids were shielded from the worst of it. Clever camera angles and editing made it look like the brood children were doing terrible things, when in reality, the young actors were just running around and waving their arms. The magic happened in the editing room. Still, having real children inside those suits gave the brood a weight and a presence that puppets alone could never achieve. Every step, every tilt of the head, every small gesture carried the spark of something alive, and that made it all the more horrifying. What looked like movie magic was really just kids playing dress-up in the strangest costumes imaginable. Number 16. The film was Cronenberg's answer to critics who called him cold. Before The Brood, David Cronenberg had already made a name for himself with films like Shivers and Rabid. Both were disturbing. Both were inventive. And both earned him a reputation as a cold, clinical filmmaker who cared more about ideas than emotions. Critics said his movies felt like experiments, brilliant but heartless. Cronenberg heard every word, and it stung. So when he sat down to write The Brood, he made a conscious decision. This film would have a beating heart. It would have a father fighting for his daughter. It would have real grief, real anger, and real love tangled up in the horror. The monsters would still be there. The body horror would still be extreme. But this time, you would care about the people being destroyed. And you know what? It worked. Audiences who watched The Brood felt something different from Cronenberg's earlier films. They weren't just grossed out or intellectually challenged. They were moved. The relationship between Frank and his daughter Candace became the emotional anchor of the story. You rooted for them, you feared for them, and when danger closed in, your heart raced, not just because of the scares, but because you didn't want to see this family torn apart any further. Cronenberg proved his critics wrong without abandoning what made him special. He didn't soften his vision, he deepened it. He showed that body horror and human emotion could exist in the same frame. What they called cold was actually a slow burn, and with The Brood, the fire finally reached the surface. Number 15. The psychoplasmics therapy was inspired by real fringe psychology. One of the most fascinating and creepy ideas in The Brood is psychoplasmics. In the film, Dr. Hal Raglan, played by Oliver Reed, practices a radical form of therapy where patients physically manifest their emotional trauma on their bodies. Rage becomes welts. Grief becomes tumors. Fear becomes something even worse. It sounds like pure science fiction, but Cronenberg didn't pull it entirely from thin air. He was genuinely fascinated by real-world fringe psychology movements of the 1970s. At the time, there was an explosion of unconventional therapies: primal scream therapy, rebirthing, encounter groups. These were real practices where people were encouraged to unleash their deepest emotions in extreme physical ways. Some of them were led by charismatic figures who operated more like cult leaders than doctors. Cronenberg took those ideas and pushed them to their most terrifying extreme. What if the body didn't just express emotion, but created new life from it? What if your rage literally gave birth to something that walked and killed? Dr. Raglan in the film is a clear reflection of those real-life gurus. He's brilliant, he's persuasive, and he's completely out of his depth when his own therapy produces results he never imagined. Oliver Reed played him with a perfect mix of confidence and hidden panic, a man who opened a door and couldn't close it. The genius of psychoplasmics as a concept is that it takes something real, the connection between mind and body, and twists it just far enough to become a nightmare. Cronenberg didn't invent the fear, he found it in the real world and gave it teeth. What seemed like fiction had roots, in fact, and that made it 10 times scarier. Number 14. The score was composed in just a few weeks under intense pressure. Howard Shore composed the music for The Brood, and what he created was haunting. A cold, creeping score that crawled under your skin and stayed there. But the process of making it was anything but calm. Shore had very little time. The production schedule was tight, the budget was small, and Cronenberg needed the music finished fast. Shore worked under enormous pressure, composing themes and recording cues in a matter of weeks. For a film this emotionally complex, that was an incredible feat. Most composers for horror films at the time leaned on loud, sudden bursts of sound, the classic jump scare approach. Shore went the opposite direction. His score for The Brood was quiet, restrained, almost mournful. It sounded less like a horror soundtrack and more like a funeral procession, and that was exactly right for a film that was, at its core, about the death of a family. Cronenberg and Shore had a deep creative connection. This was one of their earliest collaborations, and it set the stage for a partnership that would continue for decades, through Videodrome, The Fly, Dead Ringers, and many more. Shore understood Cronenberg's vision in a way few other musicians could. He knew that the real horror wasn't in the monsters, it was in the silence between the screams. The score he delivered for The Brood helped elevate the film from a simple creature feature to something deeply atmospheric and emotionally devastating. And he did it in a fraction of the time most composers would need. What sounded like months of careful work was actually a sprint, fueled by instinct, talent, and a deadline that wouldn't wait. Number 13. The film was banned or censored in several countries. The Brood didn't just disturb audiences, it disturbed entire governments. When the film was released in 1979, several countries either banned it outright or demanded heavy cuts before it could be shown. The United Kingdom was particularly harsh. The film landed on the infamous Video Nasties list during the early 1980s, a collection of horror films that British authorities considered too extreme for home video. Being on that list meant you couldn't legally rent or sell the film. It was treated almost like contraband. Other countries had similar reactions. Censors objected to the violence, the body horror, and especially the climactic scene involving Nola and the birth of a brood child. That scene crossed lines that many officials simply weren't prepared for. They had never seen anything like it, and their response was to shut it down. Cronenberg wasn't entirely surprised. He knew he was making something that would push buttons, but he also believed strongly that horror needed to challenge people. Comfortable horror, in his view, was no horror at all. If the audience walked out feeling safe, he had failed. The bans and cuts actually helped the film's reputation in a strange way. Forbidden things become fascinating. Horror fans who couldn't see The Brood wanted to see it even more. Underground copies circulated. The film became legendary, not just for what was on screen, but for the controversy surrounding it. Over time, most of the bans were lifted. The film was re-released uncut, and audiences finally got to see what all the fuss was about. Many of them agreed. It was intense, it was graphic, but it was also brilliant. What was once too dangerous to watch became a classic worth celebrating. Number 12. Art Hindle brought quiet strength to Frank Carveth. In a film full of loud horrors and extreme imagery, Art Hindle did something remarkable. He kept things quiet. As Frank Carveth, the desperate father trying to save his daughter, Hindle gave a performance that was grounded, human, and deeply sympathetic. He didn't scream. He didn't overreact. He just endured. And that made him the perfect anchor for a movie that spun wildly into the bizarre. Cronenberg needed Frank to feel like a real person. If the audience didn't believe in him, didn't root for him, the emotional core of the film would collapse. All the body horror and creature effects in the world wouldn't matter if you didn't care about the father and his child. Hindle understood this. He played Frank as a man slowly unraveling but trying desperately to hold it together. Every scene, you could see the fear behind his eyes. Not fear of monsters, fear of losing his daughter. Fear that the systems meant to protect his family were failing. Fear that the woman he once loved had become something unrecognizable. That kind of subtle internal performance is incredibly hard to pull off, especially in a horror film where everything around you is screaming for attention. But Hindle did it. He stayed real when everything else went surreal. Cronenberg later praised him for bringing exactly the right energy to the role. He said Hindle made the audience feel like they were standing in Frank's shoes, confused, terrified, and determined. Without that human foundation, The Brood would have been just another monster movie. With Hindle at its center, it became something much deeper. What looked like a simple performance was actually the glue holding the whole film together. Number 11. The Brood creatures were entirely practical effects. There was no computer magic in 1979, no digital effects, no green screens stitching creatures together. Every single Brood child you see in the film was created by hand. Practical effects artists built the suits, the masks, the prosthetics, all of it from rubber, foam, and paint. And the results were chilling. The design of the Brood children was intentionally simple but deeply unsettling. They had smooth, featureless faces, no navels, no clear signs of gender. They looked like unfinished humans, as if nature had started making a child and then stopped halfway through, leaving something hollow and wrong. Creating these effects on the Brood's small budget was a challenge. The team didn't have the resources of a major Hollywood production. They had to be creative, using every trick they knew to make things look convincing on camera. Close-up shots were carefully planned so that the seams of the costumes didn't show. Lighting was used to hide imperfections and enhance the eerie, almost dreamlike quality of the creatures. The attack scenes were choreographed meticulously. Because real children were inside those suits, every movement had to be safe and controlled. But on screen, the Brood children moved with a terrifying combination of innocence and violence, like toddlers with murder on their minds. That contrast is what made them so effective. They weren't big, lumbering monsters. They were small, fast, and relentless. The practical effects also gave the film a texture that digital effects often lack. You can feel the weight of the creatures. You can sense that something real is standing in the room. That physicality is part of what makes The Brood so enduring. Decades later, the effects still hold up, not because they're perfect, but because they're tangible. What looked like simple costumes on set became nightmare fuel on screen. Number 10. Cronenberg fought the studio over the ending. The ending of The Brood is one of the most haunting final shots in horror history. Frank holds his daughter Candace close. They've survived. The nightmare seems to be over. But then the camera slowly moves to Candace's arm, and we see small bumps forming on her skin. The cycle isn't broken. The horror has been passed on. It's a devastating, hopeless conclusion. and the studio hated it. They wanted something warmer, something that told the audience everything would be okay. A resolution, a breath of relief. Cronenberg refused. He argued that the entire point of the film was that trauma doesn't just disappear. It lives in the body. It travels from parent to child. To slap a happy ending on that message would betray everything the movie stood for. The battle was tense. Studios in the late 1970s were nervous about films that left audiences feeling uneasy. They wanted people to walk out of theaters satisfied, not shaken. But Cronenberg held his ground. He knew that the power of his film depended on that final image. If you removed the bumps on Candace's arm, you removed the film's soul. In the end, Cronenberg won. The ending stayed. And it became one of the most talked about moments in the entire film. People left the theater disturbed, exactly as Cronenberg intended. That final shot told you more about the movie's themes than any line of dialogue could. Trauma is inherited. Pain doesn't die with the person who caused it. And sometimes surviving isn't the same as being saved. What the studio wanted was comfort. What Cronenberg delivered was truth. Number 9. The film was shot in and around Toronto on a tiny budget. The Brood wasn't made in Hollywood. It wasn't filmed on fancy studio lots or in exotic locations. It was shot in and around Toronto, Canada, Cronenberg's home turf, on a budget that would make most directors weep. The entire production operated on approximately 1.4 million Canadian dollars. That's almost nothing, even by 1979 standards. Every dollar had to stretch. Cronenberg and his team had to be resourceful. They used real houses for interior scenes. They found locations that already looked eerie without needing much set dressing. The winter landscape around Toronto provided a natural bleakness that matched the film's emotional tone. Bare trees, gray skies, cold light. You couldn't have designed a better backdrop for a story about the death of a family. The tight budget forced creative solutions at every turn. If a scene was too expensive to shoot as written, it was rewritten on the spot. If a special effect couldn't be afforded, a simpler alternative was found, often one that worked even better. Cronenberg learned a lesson that would serve him throughout his career. Limitations breed invention. Some of the film's most memorable moments came directly from the constraints of the budget. The intimate, claustrophobic feel of the therapy sessions with Dr. Raglan wasn't just an artistic choice. It was also the cheapest way to shoot those scenes. 2 actors in a room, talking. And it turned out to be one of the most powerful parts of the movie. Toronto itself became a character in the film. The city's quiet suburban neighborhoods, its institutional-looking buildings, and its cold winter atmosphere all contributed to a feeling of ordinary life hiding something terrible underneath. What looked like creative vision was also pure necessity, and it worked beautifully. Number 8. Oliver Reed and Samantha Eggar never shared much screen time. Here's something most viewers don't notice on a first watch. Oliver Reed and Samantha Eggar, the 2 biggest stars in the film, barely appear together on screen. Their characters, Dr. Raglan and Nola, have a deeply intertwined story. He is her therapist. She is his most extreme patient. Their relationship drives the entire plot. But they share very few scenes face to face. Cronenberg did this on purpose. By keeping them apart for most of the film, he built tension. You heard about their sessions. You saw the results. But you rarely witnessed the actual dynamic between them in real time. When they finally did share the screen, the weight of everything unseen made those moments electric. This approach also served a practical purpose. Reed and Eggar had very different acting styles. Reed was big, physical, commanding. Eggar was intense, internal, and unpredictable. Putting them in a room together for long stretches might have created a clash of energies that worked against the film's tone. By giving each of them their own space, Cronenberg let both performances shine without competition. The effect on the audience was powerful. You felt the connection between Raglan and Nola even when they were apart. Their influence on each other rippled through every scene. It was like watching two people orbit the same dark star without ever colliding, until the very end. When the collision finally came, it was devastating. Cronenberg understood that sometimes what you don't show is more powerful than what you do. The absence of shared screen time didn't weaken the story. It supercharged it. What felt like a gap was actually a loaded silence. Number 7. Cronenberg considered The Brood his most personal film. David Cronenberg has made many films. Some are more famous, some are more extreme, some are more commercially successful. But when asked which one came closest to his own heart, he consistently pointed to The Brood. This was the film born from his own agony. The custody battle over his daughter, the collapse of his marriage, the feeling of watching someone he loved transform into someone he didn't recognize. All of that went into the script. Every argument, every sleepless night, every moment of helplessness in a courtroom where strangers decided his family's fate. It's one thing to make a personal film about happy memories. It's another thing entirely to make one about your worst nightmare while you're still living it. Cronenberg didn't wait for distance or perspective. He wrote The Brood in the heat of his pain, and that immediacy burns through every frame. He once compared the experience to bleeding onto the page. Other directors have spoken about using their work as therapy, but few have been as direct or as honest about it as Cronenberg was with The Brood. The film doesn't hide behind metaphor, or rather, its metaphors are so thin that the real emotions blaze right through. When Nola rages against her husband, you can hear Cronenberg's own arguments echoing in the dialogue. When Frank fights to protect Candace, you can feel Cronenberg's own desperate love for his daughter. This personal connection is why The Brood endures. It's not just a horror movie, it's a human document, a father's fear made visible, a marriage's death given monstrous form. What other directors kept private, Cronenberg put on screen, and the result was unforgettable. Number 6. The film influenced a generation of body horror. Before The Brood, body horror existed, but it didn't have a true champion. After The Brood, David Cronenberg became the undisputed king of the genre, and the film's influence spread far beyond his own work. Filmmakers around the world watched The Brood and saw new possibilities. They saw that the human body itself could be the source of horror, not just the victim of it. That flesh could betray you. That biology could become your enemy. That the most terrifying monsters weren't aliens or ghosts, but the things growing inside you. You can draw a direct line from The Brood to films like The Thing, directed by John Carpenter in 1982, to Cronenberg's own later masterpieces like The Fly and Videodrome, to modern body horror films like Titan and Raw. All of them owe a debt to what Cronenberg established with The Brood, the idea that horror is most powerful when it comes from within. The film also influenced how people thought about horror's potential for serious storytelling. Before The Brood, many critics dismissed horror as cheap entertainment, disposable thrills with no depth. The Brood proved that a horror film could be deeply personal, emotionally complex, and intellectually challenging without losing its ability to terrify. It showed that gore and meaning weren't enemies. They could be partners. For young filmmakers who saw The Brood during its original release or discovered it later on home video, the film was a revelation. It gave them permission to be weird, to be personal, to use horror as a mirror for real human pain. That legacy is still alive today in every film that dares to turn the body into a battleground. What started as one man's nightmare became an entire genre's foundation. Number 5. The makeup for the climactic scene took hours to apply. The most famous scene in The Brood, the reveal of how Nola gives birth to the Brood children, required extensive and painstaking makeup work on Samantha Eggar. The prosthetics were complex. Layers of rubber and foam had to be carefully applied to her body to create the illusion of external sacs attached to her torso. The process took hours. Eggar sat patiently while the makeup team worked piece by piece, building the grotesque transformation that would shock audiences around the world. The team had to balance realism with the limitations of their materials. They needed the prosthetics to look organic, like they were truly part of Eggar's body. But they also needed them to function. In the scene, Nola tears open one of the sacks and begins to lick the newborn creature clean. That action had to be physically possible within the prosthetic setup. Every detail was planned, tested, and adjusted. Eggar later described the experience as one of the most physically demanding of her career. The prosthetics were hot, heavy, and restrictive. She could barely move, and yet she had to deliver one of the most emotionally intense performances of the entire film while encased in rubber. The fact that she pulled it off is a testament to her extraordinary talent and commitment. Cronenberg supervised every detail of the makeup himself. He knew this scene would make or break the film. If it looked fake, the audience would laugh. If it looked real, they would be haunted forever. He pushed for perfection, and he got it. When the scene premiered, audiences gasped. Some turned away. Others couldn't look away. The effect was primal, visceral, and unforgettable. What took hours to build on set lasted only minutes on screen, but those minutes changed horror forever. Number 4. The film explores generational trauma before it was a buzzword. Today, everyone talks about generational trauma. Therapists discuss it. Books are written about it. Social media is full of conversations about how pain passes from parent to child. But in 1979, these ideas were rarely explored in popular culture and almost never in horror films. The Brood was ahead of its time. Cronenberg understood, perhaps instinctively, that the deepest horror isn't what happens to you. It's what happened to the people before you and how their unresolved pain shapes your life without your permission. In the film, Nola's trauma didn't begin with her. Her own mother abused her, and that abuse created wounds so deep that they literally gave birth to rage, in the form of the Brood children. The cycle is clear. Pain creates pain. Damage creates damage, and the innocent, in this case little Candace, are caught in the crossfire of wounds they didn't cause and can't understand. The final shot of the film, with the bumps forming on Candace's skin, is the ultimate expression of this theme. The trauma hasn't been defeated. It's been inherited. No matter how hard Frank fought, no matter how many Brood children were stopped, the underlying damage found a way to continue. It's a bleak message, but it's also a truthful one. Cronenberg didn't offer easy answers because there aren't any. Generational trauma is messy, stubborn, and often invisible until it erupts. The Brood made it visible. It gave it a body. It showed what it looks like when pain takes physical form and walks into the world with fists clenched. Decades before the world had the vocabulary for this conversation, Cronenberg was already screaming it from the screen. What felt like horror was actually prophecy. Number 3. Robert Silverman's small role left a giant impression. Robert Silverman appeared in The Brood in a relatively small role. Jan Hartog, a former patient of Dr. Raglan who displays the physical effects of psychoplasmics therapy. His screen time is limited, his dialogue is brief, but his impact is enormous. In his scenes, Silverman shows the audience what psychoplasmics can do to a human body. His character lifts his shirt to reveal massive, lymphoma-like growths covering his torso, the physical manifestation of his emotional trauma. It's a shocking moment, made even more powerful by Silverman's quiet, matter-of-fact delivery. He doesn't scream or cry, he just shows, and that calmness makes it worse. Silverman was a regular collaborator with Cronenberg, appearing in several of his films over the years, but this role in The Brood might be his most memorable. In just a few minutes of screen time, he establishes the entire reality of psychoplasmics for the audience. Before his scene, the therapy is just a concept, something characters talk about. After his scene, it's real. You've seen what it does. You believe it. And that belief makes everything that follows infinitely more terrifying. Cronenberg knew exactly what he was doing by placing this scene early in the film. It was a setup, a promise to the audience that things were going to get worse, much worse. And Silverman delivered that promise with precision and subtlety. He didn't need to chew the scenery, he just needed to stand there, lift his shirt, and let the horror speak for itself. Sometimes the smallest roles carry the most weight. Silverman's few minutes in The Brood did more to establish the film's world than pages of dialogue could have. What seemed like a minor scene was actually the foundation of everything. Number 2. The film was initially dismissed but later reclaimed as a masterpiece. When The Brood was first released in 1979, not everyone appreciated it. Many mainstream critics dismissed it as tasteless, gratuitously violent, and overly grotesque. Some couldn't see past the body horror to the emotional story underneath. Reviews were mixed at best and hostile at worst. It was lumped in with low-budget exploitation films, treated as disposable shock cinema with no artistic merit. But time has a way of correcting mistakes. Over the years, something shifted. Horror scholars began writing about The Brood with new eyes. They noticed the autobiographical elements. They unpacked the themes of generational trauma, the failure of institutional care, and the physical consequences of repressed emotion. They recognized Cronenberg's filmmaking skill, the restraint of the performances, the intelligence of the script, the unsettling beauty of the cinematography. Slowly, the critical consensus changed. The Brood was reappraised as one of the most important horror films of the 1970s. It started appearing on best-of lists. It was discussed in film schools. New generations of viewers discovered it and were stunned by how modern it felt, how its themes resonated with contemporary conversations about mental health, trauma, and family dysfunction. Cronenberg himself noted the irony. The same film that critics had once called trash was now being called a masterpiece. The same scenes that had been condemned as gratuitous were now praised as daring and thematically essential. Nothing about the film had changed. The world had simply caught up to it. This pattern is familiar in horror. The genre has always been underestimated, dismissed, and then retroactively celebrated. The Brood is one of the clearest examples of this cycle. What was once rejected became essential, a reminder that great art doesn't always get recognized on time. Number 1. The licking scene changed horror cinema forever. If there's one scene from The Brood that burned itself into the history of cinema, it's the licking scene. In the film's climax, Nola tears open an external sac on her body and begins to lick the newborn brood child clean, like an animal cleaning its offspring. It's primal, it's graphic, it's unforgettable, and it divided audiences like almost nothing before it. Some people walked out of theaters, others sat frozen, unable to look away. Critics called it the most disgusting scene ever filmed. Cronenberg called it the most beautiful. He saw it as a birth scene, raw, honest, and stripped of all the sanitized imagery that films normally use to depict the beginning of life. He wanted to show birth as it actually feels, messy, bloody, painful, and utterly transformative. Samantha Eggar committed to the scene completely. She didn't flinch, she didn't hold back. She licked the prosthetic creature with the focused intensity of a mother bonding with her newborn. Because that's exactly what the scene was. Beneath the horror, beneath the rubber and the fake blood, there was a genuine act of maternal connection. And that's what made it so disturbing. It wasn't just grotesque, it was recognizable. Cronenberg was showing audiences something they understood: motherhood, through a lens they had never seen before. The line between beautiful and horrifying had never been thinner. This scene influenced countless filmmakers who came after. It proved that horror could be provocative, thematic, and deeply human all at once. It showed that the most powerful scares come not from things we don't understand, but from things we do, twisted just enough to become nightmares. That one scene, just a few minutes of film, redefined what horror could be. What looked like provocation was actually revelation, and cinema was never quite the same. Bonus fact: the lost alternate opening that almost changed everything. Here's a story that very few people know. During the early stages of production, Cronenberg wrote an alternate opening for The Brood that was very different from the one in the final film. In this version, the movie would have started not with Frank and Candace, but with a long, detailed sequence inside Dr. Ragland's Soma-Free Institute. We would have seen the day-to-day operations of the facility. We would have met multiple patients undergoing psychoplasmics therapy. We would have seen their transformations in various stages, some mild, some extreme. The idea was to build the world of the film slowly, immersing the audience in the reality of psychoplasmics before introducing the main characters. It was ambitious. It was world-building on a scale that Cronenberg rarely attempted. But as the budget tightened and the shooting schedule shrank, this opening became impossible. There simply wasn't enough time or money to film all those extra scenes with additional actors and makeup effects. Cronenberg had to cut it. He later said it was one of the hardest decisions he made on the film. He loved the idea of that slow, institutional opening. He felt it would have grounded the story even further and made the horror feel more real, like something that could happen in any clinic, in any city. But he also admitted that losing it might have made the film better. Without the extended opening, The Brood starts closer to the action. You're thrown into Frank's world immediately. You feel his confusion and fear from the very first scene. The pacing is tighter. The mystery is deeper. Sometimes the things you lose make the things you keep stronger. Cronenberg's inability to shoot that alternate opening forced him to trust his audience, to let them piece the world together from clues rather than explanations, and that trust paid off beautifully. One budget cut changed the entire shape of the film and made it a masterpiece. The Brood is not an easy film to watch. It never was. But that's exactly why it matters. David Cronenberg didn't make this movie to entertain you. He made it to tell you the truth, about families, about pain, about the things we carry inside us that refuse to stay hidden. Every creature in the film is a piece of someone's anger given flesh. Every scar is an emotion made visible. And every frame is a reminder that the most terrifying horror is the kind that starts at home. This film was made with pain, built with ingenuity, and held together by performances that still feel raw nearly 50 years later. It showed the world that horror could be personal, that monsters could be metaphors, and that a small Canadian film, made on a tiny budget with rubber suits and real heartache, could change an entire genre forever. The Brood endures because it refuses to look away. And maybe that's the lesson. The things we face, really face, lose just a little bit of their power over us. If you enjoyed these stories, subscribe for more. Every movie hides a truth, and we'll keep uncovering them, one story at a time.